The drone costs less than a pickup truck.
The warship it challenged cost $13 billion. Somewhere over the open water, a cheap Iranian-built drone forced the most powerful naval platform on Earth to react, and that reaction revealed something the U.S. Navy would rather keep quiet. Not a defeat, not a disaster, but a crack. And in modern warfare, cracks spread fast. Here is the central question that matters. How can a low-cost drone expose vulnerabilities in a floating city guarded by layered defenses, nuclear reactors, and decades of doctrine? And more importantly, what does that mean for every carrier group operating today? This starts in the contested waters of the Middle East, where U.S. aircraft carriers operate under constant surveillance.
Iranian drones, confirmed models include the Shahed and Mohijer families, have been repeatedly reported flying near U.S. naval assets. Some incidents are confirmed by U.S. officials.
Others are reported through regional media and satellite imagery. But the pattern is clear. Iran isn't trying to sink a carrier. They're trying to study it. That distinction changes everything. Because when a drone approaches a carrier strike group,
the question isn't whether it can destroy it.
The question is, what does the carrier have to do to stop it? And once it does, what does that response reveal? A modern U.S. carrier doesn't travel alone. It's surrounded by cruisers, destroyers, submarines, early warning aircraft, and combat air patrols extending hundreds of kilometers. On paper, this is the most defended military asset in human history. So when a drone worth maybe $20,000 gets close enough to trigger defensive measures, the exchange rate becomes the story. Here's the cause and effect chain that matters. When a drone approaches, the carrier group must identify it. Identification requires sensors, radar, infrared, and electronic surveillance. Activating those sensors reveals frequencies, reaction times, and coverage gaps. So what? So every activation becomes data, and data is the currency of modern war. Over the past several years, Iranian drones have been reported shadowing U.S. carriers in the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Sea, and near the Strait of Hormuz. In at least one confirmed case, U.S. Navy officials acknowledged that an Iranian drone flew close enough to be visually identified by sailors on deck. That moment is not a failure, it's a signal.
Because once visual confirmation happens, it means the drone penetrated multiple invisible layers, long-range radar tracking, aerial interception zones, and electronic deterrence.
And that opens the first retention bridge. Why would the U.S. allow that to happen? The answer isn't incompetence, it's a restraint. Shooting down every drone creates escalation. It burns expensive interceptors.
It signals rules of engagement. Sometimes the Navy chooses observation over reaction.
But that choice comes with a cost. Iran's strategy here is asymmetric by design. They know they can't match U.S. naval power ship for ship, so they attack the logic of the system. A carrier group is optimized for high-end threats: enemy aircraft, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles. Cheap drones sit in an awkward space. Too small to justify a missile, too persistent to ignore. So what happens? The carrier group must adapt in real time. Fighters are scrambled. Electronic warfare systems activate. Defensive radars shift modes. Each adjustment leaves a footprint. And Iran is watching. Drones don't just carry cameras, they carry signal intelligence packages. Even when unarmed, they can collect emissions data. What turns on, how fast, and from where. That leads to the second retention bridge. What exactly could Iran be learning from these encounters? We'll answer that. But first, understand why carriers are uniquely exposed to this kind of probing. Aircraft carriers are not stealth platforms. Their size alone makes them detectable. Their power output, radar emissions, and air operations create a massive electromagnetic signature.
That's fine in a world where threats are obvious and expensive.
But drones flip the equation. A drone can afford to fail. A carrier cannot afford to reveal too much. Consider the economics. A single carrier-based fighter sortie costs tens of thousands of dollars per hour. A surface-to-air missile can cost over $1 million. The drone provoking the response might cost less than a guided bomb dropped in training.
So when Iran sends a drone, they're forcing a decision tree that always favors them economically.
That's not a tactical trick. It's a strategic pressure point. Here comes the third retention bridge. If drones can do this in peacetime, what happens in wartime when dozens appear at once? Hold that thought. Because this isn't just about Iran, it's about what Iran represents. Iran is demonstrating a model that other states and non-state actors are watching closely. If a regional power under sanctions can stress test a U.S. carrier with cheap platforms, the implications stretch far beyond the Persian Gulf. And the U.S. Navy knows this. That's why official statements are careful. Incidents are described as professional, safe, or non-threatening. The language is calm, controlled.
But behind that calm is a recalculation underway.
Because carriers are not just weapons, they are symbols. And symbols lose power the moment they appear constrained. Here's the unresolved pivot that matters going forward. If a $20,000 drone can force the world's most powerful warship to reveal how it thinks, moves, and defends itself, what does that mean for the future of carrier warfare itself? The real story isn't that a drone flew near a US carrier. The real story is what the carrier had to do because of it. Because every carrier strike group runs on a hierarchy of defenses, and cheap drones are now touching the lowest, middle, and highest layers all at once. Let's walk through that chain, slowly, because this is where the exposure happens.
At long range, a carrier group relies on airborne early warning aircraft like the E-2D Hawkeye. These planes scan hundreds of kilometers ahead,
Looking for aircraft or missiles before they become urgent. But small drones complicate this picture. Their radar signature is tiny. Their speed is slow. They blur into clutter. Birds, weather, civilian traffic. So what? So detection becomes probabilistic instead of certain. When detection is uncertain, commanders hedge. They widen sensor coverage. They change radar modes. They cue other systems to cross-check the contact. That cross-checking is the first giveaway. Because switching radar modes changes emission patterns. And those patterns can be captured, logged, and compared over time. This opens the next retention bridge. What patterns are worth collecting? The answer is timing. How fast does a carrier group escalate from passive monitoring to active tracking? How long before fighters are launched? At what distance does electronic warfare activate? Those timelines matter more than raw firepower. Analysts who track these encounters, using open source intelligence, AIS data, and satellite passes, have noted repeated Iranian drone activity along predictable carrier transit routes. That suggests intent, not coincidence. And intent here isn't provocation, it's calibration. Because once Iran understands reaction timing, it can design saturation strategies around it. This brings us to the middle defensive layer. When a drone gets closer, the carrier group must decide whether to intercept. That usually means combat air patrols, fighters already airborne, or surface ships locking tracking radars. Either way, something lights up. Electronic warfare systems don't stay invisible when they're working. Jamming, spoofing, and signal suppression all produce emissions. Even defensive countermeasures leave signatures. So a drone doesn't need to survive long. It just needs to be close enough, briefly enough. And here's the uncomfortable part for carrier doctrine. Drones compress the decision window. A cruise missile gives minutes of warning. A ballistic missile gives seconds. A drone gives ambiguity. Ambiguity is dangerous because ambiguity forces human judgment, and human judgment varies, which leads to the next retention bridge. What happens when multiple drones appear at once? This is where Iran's approach becomes clearer. Iran has invested heavily in drone swarms, not necessarily autonomous, but coordinated. Cheap airframes, redundant systems, disposable logic. In isolation, one drone is noise. In numbers, they become a forcing function. Imagine 10 drones approaching from different bearings, at different altitudes, mixed with civilian air traffic. Each one costs less than a single interceptor missile. Each one demands attention. The carrier group can handle this, but handling it means revealing priorities. Which drone gets tracked first? Which one triggers fighter launch? Which one is ignored? Those choices map the defense, and mapping the defense is the whole game. Now we reach the innermost layer, the one rarely discussed publicly: close-in weapon systems, point defenses, the last line. These systems are designed for missiles, not persistent drones. They're fast, violent, and expensive to use. Activating them in peacetime is politically sensitive and tactically revealing, so commanders avoid it unless necessary. Iran knows that. That's why many drone encounters end without kinetic action. Observation replaces destruction, but observation cuts both ways. US officials have acknowledged, carefully, that Iranian drones have become more sophisticated in how they operate around naval assets. That phrasing matters. It implies learning, and learning implies feedback. Here's the key analytical pivot. Iran doesn't need to defeat a carrier. They need to reduce their freedom of action. If carriers must operate farther from shore, if air wings must fly longer missions, if commanders must conserve interceptors, then the carrier's strategic value changes. Not collapses, changes. This is where critics often misunderstand the issue. Carriers are not obsolete. They are still devastating tools of power projection. But power projection depends on predictability, and drones inject uncertainty, which opens another retention bridge. How is the US Navy responding behind the scenes? Publicly, the answer is incremental upgrades, better radars, improved counter-UAS systems, integration of AI-assisted tracking. Quietly, the response is more profound. Doctrine is shifting from dominance to management, from assuming control of the airspace to continuously negotiating it. That's a subtle but massive change. For decades, the carrier strike group was designed to impose order on chaos. Now it must operate inside chaos, constantly watched, constantly measured. And that brings us to the strategic ripple effect. China is watching these encounters closely. So is Russia. So are smaller states that can't afford high-end navies but can afford drones by the hundreds. Iran is acting as a live fire laboratory. And the data doesn't stay local. Here's the unresolved pivot we have to confront next. If cheap drones can pressure carriers without firing a shot, what happens when they're paired with missiles, cyber attacks, and space-based tracking at the same time? Once you see the pattern, it's hard to unsee it. The drone was never the threat. The drone was the trigger. What Iran demonstrated wasn't a new weapon, it was a new way to apply pressure. And when you scale that pressure across domains, air, sea, cyber, and space, the carrier's challenge becomes clear. In any future conflict involving Iran, the opening phase would not begin with missiles. It would begin with exposure. Drones in the air, small boats on the water, cyber probes against logistics networks, satellites are watching flight deck operations in near real time. Each action alone is manageable. Together, they compress time. And time is the one resource a carrier strike group cannot manufacture. Here's why that matters. Aircraft carriers are designed around tempo, launch cycles, recovery windows,
Fueling rhythms.
maintenance intervals. These are tightly choreographed systems, refined over decades. But cheap drones disrupt tempo without crossing red lines. A drone forces a pause. A pause breaks the rhythm. A broken rhythm increases vulnerability. That's the cause and effect chain Iran is exploiting. During recent regional crises, carriers have been repositioned farther from shore, not because they were threatened with destruction, but because operating closer increased exposure. That distance translates directly into longer flight times, fewer sorties, and thinner margins. So what? So the carrier's power projection curve bends downward, not dramatically, but measurably. And in deterrence, perception matters as much as capability. Add just 200 extra kilometers to a strike mission, and you change fuel loads, payload options, and loiter time. Multiply that across dozens of sorties per day, and the operational math shifts. This leads to the final retention bridge. Does this mean the carrier era is ending? No.
But it does mean the era of unchallenged carrier dominance is over.
The U.S. Navy understands this. That's why you're seeing parallel investments. Unmanned carrier-based aircraft, distributed maritime operations, and a renewed focus on deception. Because the counter to exposure is misdirection. Future carriers will rely less on being invisible and more on being unpredictable. Emissions control, decoy drones, false signatures, rotating patrol patterns. Ironically, the answer to cheap drones may be more drones. And that brings us to the broader implication. Iran's drone encounters are not about Iran. They are about access. Who gets to operate freely in contested spaces? Who sets the cost of presence? Who forces whom to react? For decades, the answer favored the United States by default. Now, that answer is conditional, not because carriers are weak, but because the environment around them has changed faster than doctrine. This shift doesn't remove carriers from the chessboard. It changes how they're used. They become less about constant presence and more about decisive moments, less about visibility and more about ambiguity, and that has consequences for allies. If a carrier's presence is no longer a constant guarantee, regional partners must recalibrate their assumptions. Deterrence becomes shared, burdens spread, timelines tighten. That's the quiet aftershock of a cheap drone. One final point matters here. Iran didn't need a breakthrough. They needed patience. Every flight logged, every response is measured, every hesitation noted, the exposure accumulates. And while the United States adapts, because it always does, the adaptation itself is the signal that the old equilibrium is gone. So, when you hear about a drone buzzing a carrier deck, don't ask whether it could have sunk the ship. Ask what it forced the ship to reveal. Because in modern warfare, the first victory isn't destruction, it's understanding. And understanding is the one thing that no amount of armor can fully protect against.